The land here is never truly silent, though it often pretends. In the hours before dusk, the Sangre de Cristo mountains begin to whisper, dry pine needles rustling like old pages, a hawk slicing the sky with the shrill punctuation of its cry, and the wind stirring the desert scrub into a language only the rocks understand. Miriam Alcott moved slower now, not because of her years, which were not so many, but because of what those years had taken. The house stood quiet behind her, its adobe walls painted in the same worn tones as the land. Everything here had the color of memory: bleached wood, sunburnt red clay, the fading blue of a water bucket left too long in the sun. She knelt beside the goat pen, fingers trailing through the straw, pulling out thistle and burr. Her hands moved with habit, with the rhythm of someone who had spent long seasons in silence. The goats nuzzled her arms, their warmth a comfort she did not name. The sky above deepened from gold to rust. That's when she saw her, a motionless shape, half obscured by the corner post of the fence. At first, Miriam thought it a bundle of old cloth or perhaps a trick of shadow. But as she stepped closer, her breath caught. A girl, no older than 10, skin the color of burnt copper, hair tangled and matted with burrs, her small body curled against the wind. She wore a torn cotton dress, too thin for the cold that was creeping in from the mountains. Her lips were dry, her face flushed with fever. Miriam didn't speak. She never did in such moments. Instead, she knelt and placed the back of her hand against the girl's brow. A heat pulsed there, unnatural and deep, like fire trying to escape the skin. The girl moaned softly but didn't wake. Without hesitation, Miriam rose and disappeared into the house. When she returned, she carried the quilt, a heavy thing of faded indigo and soft wool, stitched by her own hands in a time when stitching had been a kind of prayer. It was her son's quilt. She'd wrapped him in it the day he left for the Plains War, and again the day the soldiers brought his body back in a pine box. Miriam knelt again and wrapped the girl slowly, gently, tucking the corners beneath her small frame. She did not know if it was the right thing to do, but the land had taught her. Rightness didn't come with signs, only with silence that settled after. She carried the girl into the house, placing her on the cot near the hearth. The fire had burned down low, so she stirred it back to life, the orange light casting trembling shadows on the mud-plastered walls. The girl did not stir, but her breath came softer now. Night fell fully. The coyotes sang somewhere far off, their voices high and lonesome. Miriam sat near the fire, eyes on the child. She made a tea of dried willow bark and wild mint, though the girl was too weak to drink it. Still, Miriam brewed it and let the steam fill the room like a soft breath. Time passed the way it often does for the solitary, not in minutes, but in the changing tones of light and warmth. Outside, the wind grew stranger, not stronger, but heavier, like it carried a weight. It pressed against the windows and door with an almost human insistence, but Miriam paid it no mind. She had lived through worse things than weather. At some point, she fell asleep in the chair beside the cot, her head resting in her hand, the fire casting her face in amber and shadow. She did not dream. She hadn't in years, but the land did, and it was dreaming of her. Just before dawn, something woke her. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation, like being watched by something old and unseen. She rose and checked the girl, still fevered, but her face was less tight with pain. A line of sweat had formed at her hairline. The fever was breaking. Miriam stepped to the door and opened it slowly. The world outside was silvered in moonlight, the desert painted in ash and pearl. The mountains loomed in their ancient stillness. Yet something in the air was not still. She heard it then, not close, not loud, but unmistakable. A chant, low, rhythmic, layered like waves crashing against ancient stone. It drifted down from the ridgelines high above her home, rolling with the wind, folding itself around the night. The language was unknown to her, but it struck the ribs like thunder in a hollow room. She stepped out onto the porch, quilt drawn tight around her shoulders. Her bare feet touched the cold earth. There were shapes on the horizon, not moving. Just there, 30 or more, all along the high line where pine met sky. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to feel. They did not descend. They did not gesture. They only sang, and the mountains sang with them. Miriam stood there until the last note faded, not into silence, but into memory, the kind of sound that never leaves, even when it's gone. When she returned inside, the girl was still asleep, but her lips had parted slightly, and her breath no longer rasped. Miriam placed a cool cloth on her forehead, then lowered herself to the chair again. The fire crackled low. The quilt remained around the girl, unmoving, as if shielding not only her body but something older, something the desert had waited to remember. Outside, the wind died. Inside, the house held its breath. Morning came slow and pale, as if the light itself were uncertain of its welcome. Thin clouds drifted across the sky, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the dry grass and sandstone ridges. The desert, so still in the night, stretched its bones and blinked awake. Inside the adobe house, silence remained, but it had shifted. It no longer pressed down with loneliness. It hovered, instead, like a held breath, like waiting. The girl stirred. Miriam was at the hearth, her hands wrapping thin corn-husk dolls, something she did in winter to keep her fingers busy. She did not look up when she heard the rustling of the quilt, the faint exhale of a breath waking into the world. She did not rush. The desert had taught her that nothing lasting comes from haste. The girl sat up slowly, the quilt falling away from her shoulders in a heavy fold. Her hair clung to her face, wild and matted. Her eyes, the color of honey burnt at the edges, scanned the room with the calm of someone used to waking in unfamiliar places. She made no sound. Miriam set the doll aside and rose. She filled a chipped bowl with cool water from the clay pitcher, walked to the girl, and offered it without a word. The girl took it with both hands, drank in small sips. Her eyes never left Miriam's. When the bowl was empty, Miriam nodded once, turned, and left the girl alone in the small front room. There was no need to speak. Words, Miriam had long understood, were often intrusions more than offerings. By midday, the girl had not moved far from the cot. She watched from the shadow of the doorway as Miriam fed the goats, milked the dough, stacked firewood, and hung dried sage bundles from the rafters. The girl's eyes followed every motion, alert, measuring. She clutched the quilt tight around her shoulders, its weight like an anchor to the present. Miriam did not press her. When she came inside with 2 warm eggs and a bit of flatbread, she placed the plate on the table and stepped back to the window. The girl hesitated only a moment before taking it. She ate with both hands carefully, like someone taught to waste nothing. No sound passed between them. Outside, the wind had changed again. It no longer carried the distant chants of the night before, but something remained, an aftertaste in the air, like cedar smoke and salt. The goats grew restless at sundown, pacing the fence line, as if listening for something just out of reach. The hens had not laid a single egg since morning. That evening, Miriam lit a single lantern and read from her Bible in the firelight. Not aloud, just the quiet rhythm of eyes moving across worn pages. The girl sat near the fire, legs crossed, watching the flames. She had not spoken once. It was on the 3rd day that Miriam found it. An eagle feather lay gently on the windowsill, its quill tucked beneath the edge of the sill as if placed with care. It was long, dark, and gleaming at the edges with soft silver. Miriam stood a moment, fingers resting on the worn frame. There were no eagles nearby, not in these hills, not anymore. She did not touch it, not yet. Inside, the girl stirred her stew with her fingers, testing its heat. Still no words. That night, Miriam dreamed for the first time in over a year. She did not remember the shape of the dream when she woke. Only the sensation, a circle of firelight in a clearing, the sound of many voices humming in tones she did not understand, and the smell of herbs burning in a clay bowl. When she sat up, breath-catching, the girl was watching her. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a moment, just a breath, something passed between them. Not understanding, not recognition, but something older. The girl blinked slowly, and Miriam lowered her gaze. On the fifth morning, the girl followed Miriam outside. She did not speak, but she did not cling either. She moved quietly behind her, bare feet stepping lightly over the cracked earth and weathered stone, her small form wrapped tight within the quilt. The goats turned their heads to her, and one of the younger ones bleated softly, stepping close. The girl placed a hand on its head and let it stay there. Miriam paused, her hands deep in the grain sack. She watched the girl out of the corner of her eye. The way she moved, cautious but not afraid. The way she placed herself between shadow and light, as if knowing the place where she would not be seen fully, but could still see. When the chores were done, Miriam handed her a small tin cup of water. The girl took it, drank, and for the first time gave a slight nod. It was enough. That afternoon, the wind died completely. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was thick, pressing. Even the birds grew quiet, as if hiding from something overhead. The shadows of the cottonwood trees sharpened, no longer soft and shifting. Miriam felt it under her skin, something watching, waiting. She stepped inside and found the girl staring out the small back window. Her shoulders were tense beneath the quilt, her breath shallow. She did not speak, but she pointed. Beyond the far fence, on the rise that overlooked the arroyo, something moved. Miriam squinted through the glass. The shape was not clear, perhaps a figure, perhaps not. It stood still, like a tree that had not been there yesterday. And then it was gone. Miriam stepped back from the window. The girl still pointed, hand trembling now. And then, slowly, she brought her hand down and placed it against her own chest. Her eyes found Miriam's. Still, she said nothing, but the message was clear. They had seen her, and they were coming. That night, Miriam placed her son's rifle by the door. Not for use, not yet, but for presence. The girl did not sleep. She sat near the fire, her eyes never closing, as if she alone could keep whatever darkness lingered at bay. She touched the quilt with her fingers, tracing the stitching, lingering at the corners. Miriam watched her for a while before closing her own eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat echoed, low and distant, like a heart buried under the mountain. It beat only once, then silence. The morning came without birdsong. Even the insects, those tiny, persistent murmurs of life, had gone quiet. The desert lay still beneath a gray lid of clouds, not thick enough to promise rain, only to dull the edges of light. The horizon, usually sharp and infinite, now blurred where sky met earth. It was a silence so complete, it seemed as though the world had paused its breathing. Miriam stood on the porch with a tin cup of chicory coffee cooling in her hands. She didn't drink it. She only held it. Her eyes scanned the ridgelines, the ones that hemmed the world to the west like the spines of a sleeping god. No movement. But the stillness itself had a shape, the kind that pressed down over the skin like wet cloth. Behind her, the girl remained curled in the corner near the hearth, the quilt tight around her shoulders, her gaze locked on the door as though expecting it to open without knock or sound. She had not spoken in all these days, not a word, but something in her had shifted. The way she watched the corners of the room, the way her ears twitched towards silence as if she heard something no one else could. Miriam set the cup down. Her fingers lingered on the wood rail of the porch. Once, long ago, she'd built a cradle with those hands and a coffin. The same tools had made both. She turned and went inside. That afternoon, she noticed the hens had left the coop. No broken fence, no signs of struggle. They had simply gone. A shallow track of small prints led out into the brush, not predators. The hens had walked single file into the desert. Miriam found a single egg in the center of their roosting box, smooth, whole, still warm. She held it in her hand for a long time before setting it in the iron pot by the window. There was no use in questions. The desert did not answer them. As dusk settled, slow and copper-colored, the wind returned. It came low to the ground, coiling like smoke between the dried mesquite, rattling the bones of the grass, stirring the dust in circles that went nowhere. It crept along the sides of the house and up into the eaves, where it moaned as if remembering something terrible. Miriam brought the goats in early. They were skittish now, eyes wide and unblinking. One of the older ones refused to step into the pen at all, choosing instead to stand facing the mountains, its head lowered in stillness. Miriam did not force it. She simply let it be. By the time the sun had slipped behind the far ridges, the house had begun to tremble, not from fear, not from storm, but from sound. It came like a vibration at first, barely more than a tremor in the floorboards. Then a hum, soft and wide, like the deep breath of the world itself. Miriam stood in the center of the room, her back straight, her eyes on the window. The girl rose from her place by the hearth, not quickly, deliberate. She stepped forward, barefoot on the cool earth floor, and reached for Miriam's hand. She had never touched her before. Miriam allowed it. Their hands met, warm, dry, human. Then the singing began. It did not come from a single place. It rose from the trees, from the stone, from the very marrow of the mountains. A low chant, layered and slow, built of syllables the land itself seemed to understand. There were no words Miriam could name, only the sound of medicine, of history, of grief folded into harmony. She stepped outside. The wind had died again, replaced by stillness, and on the ridge above the house, where the black pines gathered like sentinels, she saw them, dark forms, 30 of them, all women, still as monuments, robed in cloth that blended with the dusk. Some stood tall, others hunched with age or the weight of time. All faced Miriam's little homestead, unmoving. Their voices, unified yet distinct, rippled like water over stone. No drums, no smoke, just the chant, winding down into her blood. Behind her, the girl emerged onto the porch. The quilt hung from her shoulders like a cape, trailing at the edges in the dust. She stood beside Miriam, her head tilted back, and then for the first time she made a sound. Not a word, just a single tone, soft and aching, lifted from the deepest part of her. It wasn't childlike, it was ancient. The chant on the ridge paused, and in the silence that followed, the world itself seemed to bow. Later, in the deep of night, Miriam lay awake, the fire crackling low beside her. The girl slept again, her breathing even now, her fever broken. But in Miriam's ears, the sound of that chant echoed, not in memory, in marrow. Outside, the stars had returned, cold and clean and old. The silhouettes on the ridge were gone, but something had been left behind. In the clearing near the goat pen, where the light of the moon traced the edges of the earth, strange patterns had been drawn into the dust. Circles intersected with crescents, spirals, marks etched by hand, perhaps by fingers, stained with ash or clay. Miriam stood at the edge of the patterns and felt the weight of them, not just design, but meaning, not meant for her to understand, only to witness. She turned to go back inside and paused. An object rested on the doorstep, simple, familiar. The tin bowl the girl had used on her first morning, inside it, the eagle feather, and a single white stone, smooth and warm to the touch. She did not sleep again, but come dawn, she found herself sitting beside the girl, who opened her eyes without surprise, as if knowing Miriam would be there. Still no words, only that same gaze, and the sound of silence wrapped tight around the house, softer now. No longer a warning, no longer fear, only waiting. The path was not marked. There was no trailhead, no broken fence post pointing north, no stacked stones or bits of cloth tied to branches. But Miriam knew where to go. She knew it in her bones, in the ache behind her knees, in the tightness that had curled up near her lungs when she first saw the girl trembling in the dust. The land had been waiting for her to listen, and now it whispered clearly. Before first light, Miriam tied her hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat and stepped into the cool, gray morning. The girl stood in the doorway, bare feet on packed earth, the quilt still clutched around her shoulders. She didn't try to follow. She didn't speak. But in her eyes was something like permission or farewell. The goats stirred restlessly as Miriam passed the pen. One bleated low, uneasy, but did not move from its place. The hills above glowed faintly with the slow rise of dawn, a pale breath behind the black spines of pine. Miriam walked into the mountain. She climbed without haste, without pause. The air thinned as the land rose around her, turning from dry brush and cactus to wind-carved stone and moss-covered roots. The sounds of the world fell away. No bird song, no wind, only the rhythmic crunch of her boots over pine needles and dust. Time stretched. Minutes or hours passed. It no longer mattered. Then the scent reached her. Sage, burned, bitter, and clean. She followed it until the trees opened. The clearing appeared like something unremembered from a dream. A ring of blackened stones, moss-covered logs encircling the space like pews, and at the center, a fire that did not crackle. It pulsed, alive, but contained as if it breathed. Around it stood the women, 30 of them. Now visible in the early light, their forms were not shadowed, but clear. Each bore her age and posture, some straight-backed and tall, others bent like old branches, each marked with the quiet dignity of years endured. Their eyes did not meet Miriam's. They were turned inward into the space between one heartbeat and the next. One woman stepped forward. She was smaller than Miriam had expected, hair long and graying, bound with strips of bark and bone. Her face bore 1,000 small lines, not of pain, but of wind and sunlight, as if the earth itself had carved her slowly. She said nothing, but turned, and Miriam followed. They came to a second clearing, smaller, hidden behind a wall of elder pine. At its center lay the girl. She was curled on a bed of pine boughs and rabbit fur, the quilt draped lightly over her. Her skin glistened with sweat, and her lips were dry, but her eyes fluttered beneath the lids. She was dreaming, deeply, painfully. Around her, the healers stood in a wide circle. None moved. None sang, not yet. Miriam stood at the edge, unsure. Then the old woman lifted her hand, open-palmed, slow, and pointed to Miriam's chest, not with accusation, with invitation. Miriam stepped forward. She knelt beside the girl and gently, without speaking, folded the quilt tighter around her. The fabric felt different now, warmer, though no sun touched it. The stitching on its surface, worn and familiar, seemed to carry new symbols, ones Miriam didn't recall sewing. A crescent at the corner, a spiral in the hem. Her breath caught. The girl stirred beneath the quilt, her head tilted toward Miriam's hand. Then the chant began, low at first, a one tone, almost inaudible. One voice, old and cracked like tree bark. Then another, higher and breathier, folding itself around the first. One by one the women joined, no drums, no instruments. Just the voice of the land through human throats. The sound moved through Miriam like smoke, not choking, but heavy with memory. She felt her knees give slightly, her hands trembling where they rested on the girl's shoulder. She had heard lullabies. She had heard morning songs. This was neither. This was the voice of something being carried across. As the chant rose, the fire in the other clearing flared, a bright flash that turned white before fading to deep blue. The air shimmered with heat, though the morning was cold. The trees swayed, though no wind passed. The earth beneath the girl's body seemed to pulse, once, twice, in rhythm with the song. Miriam felt tears gather behind her eyes. She did not let them fall. One of the women stepped forward and knelt opposite Miriam. From a pouch at her hip, she drew a small bundle of herbs, dried wild tobacco, bare grass, and black sage. She crushed them between her fingers and scattered the pieces over the girl's chest. The chant shifted, its key rising slightly, as though ascending stairs made of stone and ash. And then the girl's lips parted, not in speech, not yet, but in breath. a deep, long exhale that escaped her body like smoke after a fire. The chant stopped. All at once, the clearing held its breath. The girl opened her eyes, not wide, not startled, simply open. She turned to look at Miriam, the edge of the quilt slipping from her shoulder. Her gaze was calm, no longer afraid. Her skin glowed with faint warmth, though her limbs remained still. She reached out and placed something in Miriam's hand, a stone, small, white, smooth, the same kind that had appeared in the tin bowl at the doorstep. Miriam closed her fingers around it, and the girl slept. Not the sleep of fever, but the sleep of healing. When Miriam stood, the circle of women stepped back. Their voices were silent now, their work complete. The old woman approached once more. She reached out and touched Miriam's forehead with 2 fingers, just a brush. A moment passed between them. Then she turned away, and so did the others. One by one they melted into the trees, into the hills, into the folds of the world where language is not needed. Within moments the clearing was empty. The fire still pulsed. The girl still slept. But Miriam was alone. She did not carry the girl back. She did not need to. She knew, without knowing how, that the child would return when it was time, that the path between them had been marked, not with stone or cloth, but with a blanket, a touch, and a voice. Miriam made her way down the mountain as the sun climbed into a sky pale with morning. Behind her, the chant did not echo. It remained not in the air, but in the quiet parts of her that she had thought long closed. The frost came early that year. Not a heavy freeze, not enough to kill the stubborn desert brush or chase the goats down into fevered silence, but enough to coat the water pails in a thin skin of ice before dawn, enough to sharpen the air so that every breath felt like it was pulled through pine needles, enough to make the wind bite instead of whisper. Miriam rose, as she always did, before the light had gathered, before the sky was anything more than suggestion. She pulled her coat around her shoulders, struck a match for the stove, and set water to boil. The house, as always, was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It had been 13 days since the mountains had sung, since the fire circle, since she'd knelt beside the girl and felt her hand reach out from under the weight of that fever and place the white stone in her palm. 13 mornings, 13 nights. The girl had not returned. No footprints in the dust, no feathers on the sill, no shadow on the edge of the clearing. The goats watched the tree line still, as if expecting her. But Miriam had stopped watching, not because she believed the girl would not come, but because the waiting had changed shape. It had become a kind of faith. The days moved with their quiet rhythm. Miriam moved with them, tending the fence, drying what chilies remained on twine above the window, patching the porch roof where the wind had torn through during the last storm. Her hands stayed busy, her thoughts not so much in the past now, but not quite in the present either, somewhere in the narrow place between both. At night, she found herself reaching for the quilt. The absence of it left a weight she hadn't expected. She'd not replaced it with another. Couldn't. It had been more than a covering. It had been a tether. She still kept the white stone on her nightstand, next to her son's letter, next to the tin bowl. It felt warmer some days. Others, it was cold as bone. Then, one morning, it was there. She stepped onto the porch with her usual slow stride, pulling the shawl around her shoulders, cup of coffee in hand. The sky was burnished silver, and the air smelled of juniper and iron, the kind of scent that comes before change. And there it was, hanging from the line, the quilt, still and quiet, touched by the faintest morning breeze, as if it had always been there. Miriam did not move for a long time. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. The quilt danced slightly, the same familiar weight of wool and cotton, same faded blues and sun-worn reds. But there were changes now, subtle, threaded into the fabric not by her hand, new patterns. Near the bottom hem, a row of shapes had been stitched in a thread so dark it nearly disappeared. Crescent moons, small stars, broken lines that wound like water. Across one corner, a single spiral had been added, tight, deliberate, with a center that could only be felt, not seen. At the very edge, near where the fabric met the clothesline, a handprint, small, inked in ash, the girl's. Miriam stepped down into the yard, her boots soft in the dust, and approached the line. Her hand rose but did not touch it. Not yet. The sky brightened above her, a hawk wheeled high, alone, riding a current she could not see. She turned slowly and looked toward the ridge, the same place the women had stood that night, the place where song had come down like rain. It was empty now, but not hollow. Something had been left behind in the earth, a weight, a warmth, an understanding that could not be spoken. The girl had gone, yes, but she had not left. That evening, Miriam brought the quilt inside. She did not fold it. She laid it across the foot of her bed, smoothing its surface with her palms. Her fingers traced the new stitches, learning them like Braille, like a new alphabet, made not of letters, but of moments. She sat beside it for a long time, the fire in the hearth burning low. And when she finally lay down that night, she pulled the quilt over her shoulders. It was warm, but more than that, it was alive. It smelled faintly of cedar smoke and sage, of wind through pine, of healing. She dreamed again, not of the fire circle, not of her son, not even of the girl, but of the land itself, breathing, watching, remembering. She walked through it barefoot, the white stone in her hand glowing faintly, the sky above her rich with stars. A voice, soft and low, whispered not in her ear, but in the ground beneath her steps. She did not understand the words, but they comforted her. When she woke, the morning light painted the walls in gold. A blackbird was perched on the windowsill, feathers iridescent with green. It watched her, then flew. Days passed, then weeks. The girl did not return, but she didn't need to. The house had changed. The air inside it had softened, like music no longer played but still echoing. The goat stood closer to the porch now. The blackbird built its nest beneath the eaves. The hens returned, not all but some, and began laying again. The eggs were smaller, whiter. As if beginning anew, the quilt remained at the foot of Miriam's bed. Each night it held her. Each morning she woke with fewer aches, fewer shadows. She never spoke of it to anyone. The nearest ranch was 15 miles east, and she only rode into town for salt and kerosene. When she passed others on the trail, she nodded, as she always had. And when they looked into her eyes now, they lingered a moment longer, as if sensing something she did not explain. How could she? Some things are not stories. They are songs you carry. That spring the mountains bloomed early, and on a day so clear the sky seemed to ring like crystal, Miriam stepped outside and saw, far in the distance, just before the ridge bent out of sight, a small figure walking the line of the pines. A girl, wrapped in something pale, her hair lifted by wind. She did not wave. She did not turn. She only walked. Miriam stood watching until the figure disappeared behind the curve of earth. Then she turned back to the house. A gust of warm wind passed through the doorway. Inside the quilt stirred.